And welcome back to another episode of Jason's Game Room, the only podcast here on YouTube and quite possibly the whole internet that talks about everything gaming across all genres. From board games to video games to dice games to CCGs, I've made episodes about miniatures and Pog, and you loved them. Yes, you did. If it has anything to do with the world of gaming, it's going to be on this show, and you're going to want to keep tuning in every week to see what I'm on about next. Now, on today's episode, I want to go into some, forgotten CCGs that weren't around for too long, but I played at least one or two of them. They were a lot of fun, and I don't understand why you hardly see them anymore. And granted, there are limited amounts of cards out there, especially if one of these forgotten CCGs had a short run, but at the same time, I wish I would see more of them because they really take you down a trip through memory lane from the 1990s when the CCG craze started and exploded over pretty much most of the world. And the first of these forgotten games, I actually owned a decent-sized collection at one point, and I honestly can't remember how, when, or why I got rid of them. I did have an 800-card box that had about, how many did I have? 400 or 500 worth, and of course I'm talking about, maybe even 600. Of course I'm talking about Overpower. It was the CCG based on comic book heroes, and if you remember Overpower, it came out in 1995. It started off with just Marvel, because all they had was the Marvel license. So you had every Marvel superhero and villain. The object of the game was to use heroes to defeat villains, and there were some swerves and cards in there that would either slow down or speed up the game and what have you. Overpower was a very different type of game than most games at the time, including Magic the Gathering. It was strategically and structurally different from a lot of those. And it was actually a very simple game to play. It was a lot of fun. And if you were a comic book nerd like I was, it was crack. It was even more of a cardboard crack than Star Trek CCG or even Magic. Because even though Star Trek CCG was the first game I got into when it came out in 1994, before I got into Magic as another game, I got into Overpower as a second game. And I played it for a short time, and as I said, I don't remember what happened to those cards, but it was great. Then they started expanding and getting other comic book licenses. So they got DC, they got Image. So not only did you have Marvel, but you had so many other comic book universes thrown in there with all their characters and stories and villains, and it was lovely. It was one of the most fun CCG games I had played. And unfortunately, it's gone now. It was only out for a short time. And that's unfortunate. But, you know, around 1999, the game had declined for the past year up to that point, and it went bye-bye. And I remember reading the last couple articles in Scry when it was on its way out, and I was kind of saddened at the time. Because at that time I'd already gotten rid of the collection. I kind of wanted to say, I wish I would have saved it to have it to this day. Moving on, the second game that came out, I never actually bought into this game, but I watched it played, and I wished I would have bought into it because it looked like a lot of fun. And this was Netrunner, another brainchild from Wizards of the Coast. Netrunner came out in 1996 in the spring, and basically there are two ways to play it. It is a cyberspace combat game, so you're either playing as a mega corporation or the hacker, so either the corporation or the runner. And the corporation aimed to complete its secret agendas before the runner would be able to hack in and steal the data and shut everything down. It was a very simple game to play. There weren't that many expansions for it, and again, it was one of those games that didn't last long. I think it went out in 99 or 2000. But it was an interesting concept at the time because computers were becoming more and more prevalent and the internet was turning into a thing at that point. And a few people I know jumped on the Netrunner bandwagon and played it, but it wasn't as widespread as Magic or Star Trek was. So I think because it was a Wizards of the Coast creation, if they would have released it maybe the same year as Magic, I came up with it a bit earlier, but then who was to know that the CCG craze was going to happen? If they were to bring it out earlier, it might have had more success. But Magic has always been the juggernaut in the CCG world, maybe up until now. So Netrunner didn't gain a lot of traction, and you can see a lot of sealed boxes and a lot of booster packages up on eBay for highly exorbitant prices. So it's more of a collector's item now than everything. Still a cool concept. Again, it's one of those CCGs I wish I could have played that I probably should have got into, because I do remember the starters and boosters being cheaper than most of the CCGs at the time. So, missed opportunity, but these things do happen. Finally, the third CCG I want to talk about, and I never bought this. I only read about it through Scry and Inquest magazines. I don't know anyone that ever came even close to playing it or even talked about it. I think I only had a brief conversation about it once with a couple friends of mine at a Star Trek CCG meetup at someone's house, because we had a few copies of Scry out and we were going over that. And this, of course, was Deadlands. This was a CCG that was based on the Deadlands role-playing game. If you're not familiar with that, it's Wild Wild West type thing. You're dealing with dudes and saloons, rolling dice, things like that. This CCG went from 1998 through 2001. It was reloaded in 2014, but it kind of went because you can't bring a CCG back almost 15 years later and expect something to happen, because most of the people that might have played it back in the day are now a lot older and don't have time for it. And again, it was a very interesting concept, and I still have a few scries in my possession that show articles written about it, and the gameplay seems very intriguing with the way it works. It's a story-driven game very heavily, and it ties in to the events of the RPG a lot. But again, it wasn't something that anyone even talked about. To give you an example about this, when the CCG craze was in its heyday and I was still in high school, most people were playing Magic. Some of us were playing Star Trek CCG. A few of us were playing either Overpower or the Star Wars CCG. And maybe you saw 2 or 3 people play Netrunner, as I mentioned. But there were some CCGs that came out at the time. Even Babylon 5. I was a huge Babylon 5 fan. I never got into that CCG, mainly because it was only out for a few years and it wasn't widely publicized up here in Canada. I don't even remember the 2 card shops I used to go to get CCG stuff. They didn't even have it. And that goes for Deadlands, because I read about it in Scry and I heard that it was available in the US. And I might have talked to someone in a Yahoo chat back in the day, or someone that knew about seeing it in a card shop in the US or a comic store, but I never encountered it up here. I went to 2 different card and comic stores that used to be in town where I live here, and back when I still lived in and around Toronto, there were many card stores and card shops and comic stores. Never saw Deadlands there. Some people I talked to that used to run a lot of those comic and card shops didn't even consider looking into it, because they were busy with Magic, Star Trek, and Star Wars, and of course Overpower at the time, before the new wave of CCGs came out in the early 2000s. So I think Deadlands was probably one of the biggest missed opportunities in terms of CCGs out there, because it never got marketed properly. Not enough people knew about it to play it. Now, I'm not a fan of Westerns or cowboy stuff, and I'm not someone that's going to jump on a horse and be a cowboy. Never been that guy. I've been a city boy. But after reading the articles in Scry at the time, I was slightly interested in playing it, just because it looked kind of cool. And again, because it was not marketed properly, and you never saw it hardly anywhere up here, if anywhere, because no one's told me about seeing it in Canada, nobody played it. And there were a lot of CCGs in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s that suffered from that. There was not enough exposure and they didn't get played. And that's why a lot of CCGs became forgotten over the years, because either they weren't popular, not enough people got into them, or they just weren't marketed at all and nobody even bought them or knew to buy them. That's all for today. In the comments below, let me know your take on forgotten CCGs. Maybe there's some that you've played that I don't know about. Lord knows there's been a lot of CCGs come and go over the years, so there's probably a lot more I don't know about or forgotten about that you guys have played. So let me know. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, tell all your friends, and more importantly, game on.